Excuse me. Ha! I think there's been a mistake. Excuse me. I think there's been a mistake.
Huh? No, sir. First-class seats are reserved. You cannot sit here.
No, sir. First-class seats are reserved. You cannot sit here.
I understand the policy, but I've flown this route many times. There must be a solution.
Stop everything. This isn't just another flight story. Imagine walking into a first-class cabin, confident, relaxed, and ready for your trip, only to be told you cannot sit there because of who you are. That's exactly what happened to this black CEO. In a matter of 12 minutes, he turned what should have been a routine, ordinary airline experience into a scene of chaos that left passengers, staff, and even executives completely speechless. It all began on a hectic, bustling morning at one of the country's major airports. Travelers scurried through the terminal, luggage wheels clattering against the polished floors. Security lines snaked like rivers of rushing people. Intercoms echoed boarding announcements, and flight attendants moved with practiced precision, guiding passengers with smiles and polite gestures. Every flight had its rhythm, its predictable routine, but this one was about to shatter it completely. Among the crowd was Elijah Reed, a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, yet whose presence here was anonymous. Known for his razor-sharp business acumen, calm confidence, and reputation for quietly getting things done, Elijah navigated the terminal with a focused stride. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek attention, and no one on this flight yet realized that they were about to witness someone who could quietly change the course of events in minutes. He approached the first-class cabin, suitcase in hand, expecting a smooth and uneventful boarding process. He had flown countless times, enjoyed the privileges of his business standing, and anticipated a calm, orderly journey. But in the blink of an eye, all of that expectation crashed into an invisible wall. The flight attendant, her tone polite but firm, looked at him and said words that would ignite the storm. "I'm sorry, sir." "Your ticket doesn't allow you to sit here." Elijah paused. His calm composure remained intact, but inside, a surge of disbelief flickered. Shock, confusion, and even a flash of anger rippled through him. But the reaction that followed was not what anyone expected. The first-class cabin fell into an almost eerie silence. Passengers, mid-conversation, suddenly sensed that something unusual was happening. Eyes darted toward the scene. Whispers started, quiet at first, then growing louder, spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Phones emerged from pockets as instinctively as if people knew this moment was about to be extraordinary. Some leaned forward slightly, curiosity piqued. Others glanced nervously at the flight crew, wondering why ordinary boarding rules had suddenly turned into a tense showdown. But the tension wasn't about policy or seat allocation. It wasn't about miles, tickets, or class restrictions. This was about judgment, plain and simple. It was about someone making a decision that felt personal, unfair, and targeted, and the room instinctively knew it. Elijah, standing there with quiet dignity, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, and didn't demand immediate correction. Instead, he radiated calm authority, a presence so strong that it caused a subtle shift in the cabin's energy. The whispering grew, passengers leaning closer, sensing that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect, recognition, and the realization that ordinary people sometimes underestimate extraordinary individuals. The cabin atmosphere transformed. What should have been routine became tense, electric, and suspenseful. Every movement, every glance, and every breath felt magnified. People waited, some with nervous curiosity, some with outright shock, as Elijah silently prepared for what would unfold next. In those moments, the ordinary terminal drama of boarding a flight had become a stage for something far bigger. A test of composure, influence, and power. And just like that, a simple denial of a seat became the spark that would ignite one of the most unforgettable airline stories of the year. Elijah didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't slam his hand on the counter or demand to speak to a manager. Instead, he smiled politely, calm and composed, the kind of smile that could disarm even the most stubborn person without a word of aggression. "Excuse me," he said softly, his tone smooth and deliberate. "I think there's been a mistake." But the flight attendant remained unmoved, her insistence rigid and procedural. "No, sir," she said, her voice polite but unwavering. "First-class seats are reserved. You cannot sit here." A hush began to fall over the cabin. Passengers in business class paused mid-conversation, while those in economy craned their necks to watch. Phones started appearing in hands, cameras poised to capture what might happen next. There was something about this moment, something that didn't feel ordinary. People instinctively sensed that the man standing quietly before them was no ordinary traveler. Elijah's calmness contrasted sharply with the rising tension. The attendant's words carried authority, yet the quiet power radiating from him seemed to overshadow hers. Some passengers whispered to each other, incredulous. Others leaned forward, curiosity sparking in their eyes. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't raise his voice. But the weight of his presence seemed to fill the cabin, causing even seasoned flight crew members to pause and take notice. Instead of confronting the situation with anger, Elijah stepped aside just enough to not block the aisle, creating a subtle but deliberate space around himself. He pulled out his phone, fingers tapping swiftly, sending messages, making calls, small, deliberate moves that suggested strategy, planning, and influence. He didn't threaten. He didn't demand. He simply worked quietly, behind the scenes in the calmest possible way. Every movement was precise, intentional, and measured. For those watching, the tension was almost unbearable. The air in the cabin felt thick with anticipation. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. A coffee cup rattled slightly on a nearby tray table, and it sounded disproportionately loud in the silence that had fallen over the first-class cabin. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the unfolding scene was far more than a simple boarding dispute. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who is this man? Why is everyone suddenly so alert? Phones continued to pop up, passengers capturing videos, some trying to lean closer without being noticed. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a recognition that they were witnessing something rare, a test of patience, control, and quiet power. Elijah's calm demeanor was magnetic. It drew attention without effort, demanded recognition without shouting, and conveyed authority without overt assertion. The flight attendant, once confident, now seemed slightly off balance, sensing that ordinary procedures might not suffice in this situation. What had started as a routine denial of a seat had morphed into a subtle, invisible standoff, an unspoken battle of influence and command. And yet, despite the rising tension, Elijah remained serene. He didn't need to escalate. He didn't need to confront. He simply allowed his presence, his quiet confidence, and his precise, controlled actions to speak for him. All he needed was 12 minutes to make a series of calm, deliberate moves that would turn a seemingly unfair situation into a demonstration of power, influence, and respect. Passengers leaned forward, sensing that the next moments could be extraordinary. Phones were recording, conversations were whispered, and even the crew seemed to understand. This was no ordinary passenger. Something was about to happen that would leave a lasting mark, not just on the airline staff but on everyone watching. In that quiet, intense, and suspense-filled cabin, the ordinary rules of air travel had suddenly changed. This was no longer about tickets or boarding passes. This was about authority, strategy, and influence. And Elijah Reed was about to show everyone exactly how a master handles injustice without ever losing control. While passengers nervously exchanged glances and whispered to one another, Elijah Reed didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice or demand immediate action. Instead, he quietly pulled out his phone and began making a few calls. Calls that would reach far beyond the cabin, far beyond the airport, and all the way to the very top of the airline's leadership. Within minutes, his influence began to ripple through the company like a shockwave. Executives at the headquarters realized almost immediately that this was no ordinary passenger causing a scene. They understood, in those first moments, that they were dealing with someone whose authority and vision extended far beyond the boundaries of a first-class ticket. This wasn't just a CEO. This was a man whose decisions affected millions, whose network could influence markets, and whose reputation demanded attention. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire from row to row. Some passengers leaned forward slightly, eyes wide, convinced that a confrontation might erupt at any second. Others whispered questions to their neighbors. Who is this man? Why is the airline staff hesitating? What's happening? The cabin had become a stage for tension, a silent drama where every glance, every gesture, and every breath carried weight. The flight crew, trained to handle stressful situations, couldn't hide their unease. They had managed delayed flights, unruly passengers, and small disputes countless times. But this felt different. The ordinary rules of authority no longer applied. Policies suddenly seemed fragile in the face of something invisible but undeniable. Elijah's quiet power. Flight attendants exchanged nervous looks, unsure how to enforce rules when the room itself seemed charged with anticipation. Passengers began to check their phones surreptitiously, recording videos or texting friends, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The chatter that had been building in hushed whispers now buzzed just beneath the surface, a mix of excitement, confusion, and fear. Even seasoned travelers leaned forward, sensing that what was about to happen would be remembered for a long time. Then, as if timed perfectly, 12 minutes passed. The cabin grew still, every eye locked on the front of the plane, every ear tuned for an announcement. And then it came. Attention passengers, due to operational issues, this flight has been temporarily grounded. A wave of shock and confusion swept through the cabin. Passengers murmured, some grumbled, others stared blankly at each other. A few pulled out their phones, unsure what had just occurred, trying to record or figure out the cause. Yet the real story remained invisible to them. The flight wasn't grounded because of technical failure, weather, or routine scheduling. No, the airline had been reminded in no uncertain terms that power, influence, and authority cannot be ignored, and that one man, calm and composed, had the ability to shift the course of operations without ever raising his voice. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. People speculated frantically, creating scenarios in their heads. Some thought it was a safety concern. Others imagined a protest or a sudden emergency. But the truth was far more remarkable. One man's presence, intelligence, and strategic calm had forced the airline itself to act. Passengers leaned back in their seats, trying to process what had just unfolded. There was a sense of awe in the air, mixed with lingering tension. No one wanted to make a sound, as if acknowledging the moment might break the invisible spell that Elijah had created. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't argued. He hadn't demanded. And yet, the airline had bent its operations in deference to him. The lesson was clear. True authority comes not from anger, entitlement, or volume. It comes from presence, intelligence, and a mastery of timing. By the time the airline began coordinating the necessary adjustments, the cabin had transformed from a place of ordinary travel to a room filled with witnesses, to a subtle but powerful demonstration of influence. Every passenger, crew member, and onlooker had seen firsthand how calm, strategic authority can command results in ways that force even large organizations to respond. And in those 12 minutes, Elijah Reed had quietly rewritten the rules of the game, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. Elijah walked through the cabin with a calm, measured stride, every step deliberate, as if the floor beneath him acknowledged his authority. There was no trace of anger on his face, no clenched fists, no furrowed brows, no raised voice. Yet the atmosphere shifted the moment he entered the aisle. Passengers felt it immediately, a magnetic presence that commanded attention and respect without a single word of aggression. It wasn't intimidation. It wasn't arrogance. It was quiet power, the kind that can silence an entire room and leave even the most confident observers unsure of what to do. Flight attendants and airline staff, trained to manage 100 different situations every day, instinctively recognized it. They could sense that this was a man who had won without a fight. No shouting, no demanding, no tantrums, just calm, composed authority. Policies, rules, and ordinary procedures seemed to shrink in his presence, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement that this situation was bigger than a ticket dispute. The staff felt it in their posture, in the way their hands hovered uncertainly over their equipment, in the subtle hesitation in their movements. Elijah didn't need to enforce his authority. It existed naturally, radiating outward, shaping the energy of the cabin with silent precision. Passengers were captivated, unable to look away. Phones appeared in hands, recording every subtle gesture, every calm word. Every glance that seemed to carry the weight of experience and command. Some whispered quietly to their neighbors, trying to understand what was happening, voices tinged with awe and confusion. Others laughed nervously, unsure whether to be entertained or concerned, while some simply shook their heads, mouths slightly agape, witnessing a scene they would not forget for years. Every eye was on him, every mind trying to decipher how a man could turn an encounter that should have been humiliating into a masterclass of control, authority, and dignity. Elijah moved past rows of curious passengers, his gaze calm, confident, and steady. He leaned slightly to speak quietly to a nearby passenger, voice soft but precise. "You see," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Sometimes, power isn't about confrontation. It's about making people realize who you are without ever saying a word." The words seemed simple, almost conversational, yet their impact was profound. They encapsulated everything that had just unfolded. It wasn't about raising one's voice, about acting aggressively, or about retaliating in anger. It was about presence, patience, and the subtle art of demonstrating authority through composure and self-control. Passengers listened, absorbing the lesson, some nodding quietly, others staring in disbelief. realizing they had just witnessed an extraordinary display of human influence. By the time the airline staff managed to resolve the situation, adjusting seating, rechecking records, and coordinating with their headquarters, Elijah was already seated in first class. He settled into his seat with the ease of someone who had always belonged there, calm and collected, his composure intact. He adjusted his tablet, sipped his drink, and looked around casually, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet the lesson had already been delivered loud and clear. This was not just a seating dispute. It was a demonstration of authority, influence, and mastery over chaos. Passengers whispered to each other, some replaying the scene in their minds, others scrolling through their phone videos. Crew members exhaled, relief mixed with awe. And through it all, Elijah remained unshaken, a living example of how true power works, not by shouting, not by demanding, not by confrontation, but through controlled presence, quiet confidence, and the ability to command a room without ever forcing compliance. By the time the engines roared to life and the plane began taxiing down the runway, every person on that flight had learned an unforgettable lesson. Real authority isn't given, it's recognized. Real influence isn't loud, it's felt. And Elijah Reed had proven that in 12 minutes, a single person could quietly but absolutely change the course of events and leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The flight eventually took off, but the story didn't end there. News spread quickly. Passengers shared videos online, and within hours, the incident went viral. People debated, argued, and celebrated Elijah's composure. He had turned a moment of discrimination into a masterclass of calm, influence, and justice. Here's the question for you. If you were on that flight, would you have stood up like Elijah, or stayed silent and let the situation slide? Comment below, I want to see what you would do. If this story gave you chills, or made you think about the power of calm under pressure. Mash that like button. Share this video with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where ordinary moments turn into extraordinary lessons in courage and power. Remember, real influence isn't in what you demand. It's in how you command respect. Hit subscribe and join our community of everyday heroes who turn challenges into victories.